it is sometimes just the easiest way to do it. All right, everybody seeing that? I guess you normally put this up at the beginning, so I'll sort of dive right into it. Just a brief background on the college competencies. Jonathan knows this already, but it's surprising how many people have sort of lost track that we actually adopted the definitions for the college competencies way back in 2014. That was a faculty senate vote after much discussion about what are the things we think our students should be learning. And it's really, they really are, in the assessment parlance, institutional learning outcomes, which is to say, what do we think our students should be learning regardless of what program they're in? So whether you're in game design or accounting or social work or graphic design, what should all the students who graduate from Champlain have? And this is what we agreed upon collectively as a body in 2014, ratified by the Board of Trustees and the President, of course. Then it took a while to sort of develop those out in more detail. In 2015, 2016, we engaged in a round of curriculum mapping where we mapped the original 9 competencies to all of the required courses using the definition, the 1 to 2 sentence definitions that were voted on by the faculty in 2014. In 2018 and 2019, we added a competency for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We had a very comprehensive and widespread process of rubric development where over 50 faculty and staff participated in working groups to develop competencies for the now 10 and then 12 competencies. How we got from 9 to 10 was we added diversity, equity, and inclusion at the urging of the provost. How we got from 10 to 12 was the belated realization that we had crammed several things together that didn't really belong. So scientific and quantitative literacy were jammed in the same category. Technology and information literacy were jammed in the same category, even though they're manifestly different things. And actually, look for this to come at the next Faculty Senate meeting in end of March, early April, because we're finally officially separating those literacies. But the teams developed these very, very detailed rubrics, developmental rubrics, which could be used for faculty to evaluate, but also I came to realize over time they were really powerful communication tools, or potentially really powerful communication tools to communicate to students, here's what we're expecting you to do when we say we want you to collaborate, think integratively, be information literate, and so on and so forth. So we finished developing those rubrics and road tested them, and then I have to give credit to John Stroop here for saying, can we find ways to communicate these more simply or more directly? And so that led the College Competency Committee to develop what we call guiding questions and holistic rubrics, and I'll show you all these things in a little bit. And also in 2020, the Degree Design Lab program started up, and the Degree Design Lab has, as part of its curriculum, students have to demonstrate proficiency in all of the college competencies as a condition for graduation, which they do by building portfolios of evidence. And that was also a tremendous learning process for us to continue fine-tuning the different rubrics, continue fine-tuning the different guiding questions. And also, we're a real proof of concept. So when these Degree Design Lab students sit down to prove proficiency or demonstrate proficiency for graduation, they really think very deeply and thoughtfully, and actually they do it even before then, because knowing that they're going to have to demonstrate proficiency at some point, they take these competencies, collaboration being one of them, very seriously and think about, okay, how can I incorporate this into my day-to-day practice? If I have a group project this semester, I'm going to look at the collaboration competency guidelines and see, are we doing the things that the competency asks us to do? Which is a good thing, because the competencies were designed by people with particular expertise. Collaboration in particular, I'd single out Jonathan, who's with us, also Kylie King are the two that I remember. Jonathan, you remember who else was on that working group?
Yeah, let's see, we had Lindsay.
Lindsay, right.
And spacing on the other person. But yeah, that's a pretty good team.
So very good team. These people have particular expertise in this area, and so it really represents people who have particular expertise coming together and saying, okay, what does this look like in Champlain for a Champlain student? So we have these definitions and developing, develop definitions that are really specific to Champlain. So what are the elements of collaboration that group came up with? We boiled it down to 6. Originally, there were 19. Jonathan may remember, but we boiled it down to 6. These are the different elements that really make for a successful collaboration. Cohesive vision. The group should know what their goal is, and they should be in agreement as to what their goal is. Role identification. They should know who is doing what, and that should be clear. And diversity, equity, inclusion. Another college competency, but here it is really about encouraging and integrating different perspectives. Diversity of views can be intellectual, they can be conceptual, they can be cultural. But we know from experience and also from a lot of research that teams that try to look for diversity of viewpoints usually come up with better solutions or better responses in the end. Iteration, do they have a process whereby they are refining and reflecting upon not only what they're working on, but also the process and outcomes that they're using in the collaboration? Are they coordinating with each other? Are they communicating? With each other? Is that something that happens regularly? And of course, accountability. Once you've identified roles, are people doing the things that are expected of them? And do you have ways to hold various group members accountable for what they said they would do or what's expected of them? So we then develop these, and I'm going with the guiding questions first because I think these are most helpful from a teaching standpoint. So these guiding questions really correspond to the different criteria on the rubric, the different elements of successful collaboration, as Jonathan, Lindsay, Kylie, and others have helped us identify. So I think these are really, really helpful in as much as they are things that you can give to students. They can be the backbone of your reflections if you want. And they can be used by students for self-assessment. They're deliberately designed for students, or really anybody. I mean, they could be applied for us as well when we are engaged in collaboration, to sort of check-ins. Am I doing these things? Is the group doing these things? Again, designed to try to communicate the expectations of collaboration in Champlain in a way that is not sort of in a large table, which I'm about to show you, which has its own uses, and some people like tables, but there are definitely many of my colleagues who shy away from tables of any kind. I can't explain it. I don't know why, because I like them, but everybody has sort of different expectations and they like different things. I'll share this with everybody afterwards, but while I'm thinking about it right now, let me share a link to the guiding questions. And so here's the first 2 lines of the rubric. And so you might see how some people would find this a little bit forbidding. A lot of words there, a lot of colors. But the goal of the rubric itself is to provide what are the different levels and what would it look like if groups or individuals are doing these things at different levels. So the goal, and we try to set, the goal is for our students to be proficient when they graduate. And so that level is really, when in the degree design lab, that's what I tell my students to aim for. I said, this is what you're aiming for. If you get the exemplary, great. Some people do. But the rubrics were designed with the idea that with help, most Champlain students would be proficient. They would be doing it at this level by the time they graduate from Champlain. Really, that's because that's our promise to them. Come to Champlain, and regardless of your program, we'll do our best to make sure that you are able to do these things by the time you graduate. So if you would like to take a look at the rubric, all these, by the way, continue to be open for commenting. So we are closing in on some finalized language for the guiding questions for the time being, because we want to make them a lot more public. We want to put them on the public-facing website. We hope that people will make better use of them. We're probably even going to build a set of cards, if at all possible. Jonathan may be on that. If some of you may remember the mapping exercise with the cards, we want a new set of cards with these more detailed definitions on them. But the rubrics were originally designed for sort of faculty evaluation. This is a way that faculty can sort of provide quick and responsive feedback to students, and also over time we came to realize the role of the rubrics also played in communicating these things to students, potentially, so that we tried to reframe the language in more appreciative tones. We tried to make it more student-facing. We believe it still works both as a communication device, but also as an evaluation tool should you wish to use it. I should say that I don't think this is true for the campus community as a whole, but it is true in the core, because that's the part of Canvas that I have access to, that these also exist in Canvas. And you can pull them down into Canvas assignments. You can pull down the entire rubric. You can also pull down individual criteria, which is and add them to an assignment. You can either add them to a rubric that you're making yourself, or you can simply have them there if the assignment that you're giving to the students draws on some of these criteria as an additional way of sort of providing feedback to the students. So and now here's where I'm probably going to get in hot water, potentially with so many experts and collaboration in the room, because I'll be honest, I don't often teach group projects. I have not been teaching the core classes where collaboration is required. I have taught group projects in the past, but I was thinking through this just from a clean sheet of paper. I was like, if I was going to teach this next semester, how would I do it? So I've got some basic principles. And again, the game programmers here probably not going to surprise anyone. I really was thinking some core colleagues would be here as well, and so this is thinking primarily for them. But these are my basic principles, and they're my opinion. And I would invite, and when we're going to turn to sort of widespread discussion in a few more minutes, I would absolutely invite you to take issue with any of these, or accentuate them, or offer examples that you might do. So my basic principles are these. I think they work best in group projects. For some reason, there's a number of faculty, I won't name any names, but who are diametrically opposed to group projects of any kind. And when I talk with them further about it, it really boils down to the fact that they were the kind of people who end up doing all the work in group projects when their fellow group mates didn't do the work, which helps explain why they're academics, I guess. Probably because not because they like to do things alone, but because they were the ones who were going to pick up the ball and make sure the project got done. And that's why they persisted on to advanced degrees. But as a result, many of my colleagues are scarred. And so I know, Kylie, in the last round where we had this discussion, you did open up the question as to whether or not you can teach collaboration through other ways. I would say that that's possible, and I would look forward to more discussion about that if you like. I do think it's best in group projects, especially the way that Champlain has defined it. And let's face it, most of our students are going to enter workplace environments where they will likely have to participate in group projects. So I think it's best if we prepare them to do that. This is something, again, that my core colleagues don't always think of, but I imagine many people here do, and that is that you need to set aside classroom time to review the elements, right? What does it mean? It means actually teaching the skill itself. The analogy I like to use is that you can introduce kids to basketball by putting them on a basketball court, giving them a basketball and shutting the door and hoping they do okay. But you're probably going to get a lot better results if you take the time to say, here's how you dribble, here's what a free throw looks like, here's how you pass the ball. So if you actually take the time to teach them what it does mean taking time away from content. But in the world that we're setting our students out into, I would argue that really giving them the skills to be more successful is as important, if not possibly more important, than the content that we're giving them. The third point on this list, it's a more general item, really applies to all assignments, but just being transparent. What are your expectations? Be open with them. I'm designing the assignments and the prompts in this way because these are the things I'd like you to do when you do the thing, in this case, collaboration. And there's actually a lot of really good research on transparency in assignment design that shows that it helps all students, but it is actually particularly helpful for traditionally underrepresented groups in higher education. So minoritized populations, first-gen students, they get helped significantly more than the other students who are starting from a higher level. There's a lot of good reasons to do this. Finally, I believe it's really, and this one I'm going to fight to the death over if anybody disagrees with me. It's really important that you have multiple check-ins. You have multiple smaller assignments that you scaffold that both allows you to get insight into the group processes as they're happening and not just at the end, but also gives you the opportunity to give them feedback and also helps them pay attention to these things that you want them to pay attention to, which they may not do if you just introduce it to them. So what might this actually look like? So here's where I'm looking forward to having some feedback on this. The next time I teach collaboration, I'm going to have them form the groups. I'm going to have a very initial check-in right after group formation, where I ask them to answer the questions for cohesive vision and role identification. And those are the questions that, just to remind you real quick, these questions right here. If you don't like the language here, that's okay. I would definitely recommend that, however, that the names of the criteria, iteration, cohesive vision, and so on and so forth, that you actually actively use those names when you are assigning, when you're asking students about them. And the reason why I strongly recommend that you do that is because to the extent to which these words become sort of a shared vocabulary across different classes, both program classes and core classes that are teaching our students collaboration, the more likely it is that the students are going to recognize when they've done it before. Oh yeah, we did this in Core 202 with Waymeyer, or we did this in Core 103, or oh yeah, we did this in Game Production 1. So we know what this is, we know what these things are, and we've practiced them before. It doesn't really necessarily have to be something that's entirely new. So for the collaboration, but also the college competencies in general, I think there's a lot of promise there for our students to really make better gains when they see these sort of shared vocabulary being used across different courses, across different program courses, and across the core. So again, the way I would do it, check-in 1, cohesive vision, role identification. What's your goal? Who's doing what? I would then, and you could combine these in different ways if you wanted to, but I'd probably wait a week and then say, all right, you've got a vision, you've got your roles. How are you keeping in touch with each other? How are you holding each other accountable? What processes are you using? There's a lot of software out there. Many of you have none that I've ever used directly, but I know of things like Trello, and I'm sure there are others out there which I'll hear about when we get to the conversation. But it doesn't necessarily have to take place within, I know some of the software developers use GitHub. It doesn't have to take place within those software packages. There are ways in which communication accountability can happen through much more simple things. Google Docs saying who's doing what, SMS, text messages if that's how they want to stay in touch. It doesn't really matter to me. What matters is they set up a process that works for them. I would then, perhaps a week or two later, then have a check-in, and these could be, by the way, group documents, group submissions. It's an open question as to whether you want them, each student to do them individually or each student to do them as a group. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, I would say, all right, are you having processes to make sure that all the voices are being heard equally? Do you have processes for figuring out or looking for perspectives that might not be included that would be really valuable to have as the project goes forward. And then, of course, are you examining your processes as you are developing whatever it is you are working on? Are you have cycles of iteration that allow you to refine whatever it is? And also, are you examining your own processes? Are these things working? I would probably also, probably about 2/3 of the way through, have an individual assignment where I circle back because I want to have individual feedback. Do you believe individually that the group is adequately accounting for diverse perspectives? Can you give me an example of where that happened? Do you think the group is communicating well and holding each other accountable? This is just, again, my basic schema. I'm absolutely open to ways in which this can be adjusted or dramatically changed based on those of you who have more experience than I do. And I would absolutely have a postmortem. By the way, I would phrase most of these as sort of reflective assignments. And by reflection, I mean reflection on process. So we're asking the students not to say, oh, how do you feel today? But rather, I want you to be aware of and making intentional choices in the processes that you are developing and then using to collaborate successfully. And I would definitely have a postmortem, vision rules, where I pretty much have all 6 criteria, and I'd ask the group and perhaps individually, please respond to each of these. And I would again go back. Primarily, my inclination would be use those guiding questions, which Jonathan and Lindsay and others have developed. But however you do it is really up to you. So I'm stopping here because I wanted to create a lot of space for people to sort of share, to either react to what I said, add further things, or share examples of things that they have done, that types of assignments or assignment prompts that work for them. So I'm going to stop talking now and open up the floor. Yeah, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Just a couple things really quickly. I'm wondering if it might make a lot of sense for you to present at some point this same presentation to staff council and or managers roundtable. And the reason I say that, as I was looking at the list again of criteria, I realized that our student workers are collaborating within the departments in which they're working. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if our students are recognizing that they are learning collaboration through their work study programs, and if managers understood some of these competencies, they would feel a part of the student growth and development if they had a way to, again, use the same language or look at this criteria and then talk with our students. We do exit evaluations of our student workers, and I would love to have this in mind, both at the beginning of the hire and the onboarding process, and also at the end during the evaluation process. And the other piece that I wanted to mention is just thinking about what you said about how important it is to set the student up for success and to be able to self-assess what's happening and process through what's happening while they're collaborating. I wonder if it might be really helpful for our first year courses to be extra intentional about this and introduce it, but then also provide some guided practice where you have some mock assignments, like really short assignments or really brief things that you could do in the classroom, and then go through the whole process with them and let them practice it, so that when you ask them for that feedback later, they're not all just sort of thinking that they're doing it, but they know exactly what it is you're asking. You know what I mean? Like, because if you have everybody in the group that says, yeah, we're doing pretty well on this, but if you were actually sitting in that group, you would maybe assess it differently than how they assessed it. So having some time of guided practice, I think, would be really a helpful part of your process.
Yeah, so if I could, I see Kylie and Ben are raring to go, but let me just respond to both of your points really quickly. First of all, I think staff council is an excellent idea because institutional learning outcomes, and we've stressed this in the past, but it's easy to sort of get lost in the shuffle. Really, education is really not just what happens in a classroom. College education is really the whole package. It's their, if they're working as a student jobs, it's how they sort of cooperate in the student-run clubs. It's how they get along with each other in the dorms. And that's really, that's the selling point of a residential educational experience. That the education, not just what happens in the classroom. Something professors don't always like to think about. They like to think that the only education that really matters is what happens in the classroom. But if you think about education much more broadly, as I do, I think it's really important that anyone who comes in contact with students can potentially participate in the educational experience of that student. And so making these events, so I think it's an excellent idea to talk to staff council about this. We actually did, when we developed the college competencies way back in the day and did the roadshow back in 2015 or so, we actually did go to staff council meetings and spread that message. But it's really hard to keep up that momentum when so many other things are going on. But I absolutely agree with you, and I'd love to do that. So if you consider who we might, and I'd prefer to do it even in conjunction with Jonathan and Kylie, to be honest with you, because they've also been deeply involved in this and know more about collaboration than I do. As to the guided practice thing, I mean, it fits with what I was talking about earlier, how you actually teach them the skills and you work on the skills, and that would be even a further enhancement. I think you can also deliver some of that feedback through, the early iteration process. So the early rounds of feedback that you get is like, oh yeah, we're doing this, but it's not just, are you doing it? Give me an example. Show me the method of communication. And this is what we do in the degree design lab. So the portfolios of evidence that the students put together, they have to literally show me examples. Me and the other reader, who's the second or third reader on that, they show examples of, yeah, here's what we did. Here's how we successfully communicated. Here's an example of our communication methods. Here's a email chain. One of my students got a little bit of trouble when she was, she's like, okay, we use Snapchat. I'm like, great, screen cap some Snapchats. So she did, and one of her colleagues said, hey, why'd you just screen cap my Snapchat? Because apparently Snapchat has some built-in software that alerts you when someone else screen caps your message. So she got a little bit of trouble, but I asked them to actually physically provide me with artifacts that show that you're doing these things. So that really becomes powerful because, and just happened last week where a student said to me, oh, she just demonstrated creative thinking, or excuse me, communication. And the following week she says, I was working on this marketing thing and I had that communication rubric in the back of my mind. I'm like, who's my audience? What's the context? What's the purpose? What are my channels? And that's really what we want students to do. We want them to be conscious and intentional about these choices, right? So I do agree with you, the guided practice would definitely work. I'd love to know more about how to specifically implement that. So, all right, I'm gonna go in the order they appear on the screen here. Kylie, go ahead.
Woohoo! So I liked one of your last slides where you talked about introducing these ideas and reflective assignments at different points during the semester. I have not explicitly done that. So I think that's really interesting, and then having them reflect on things individually later. So thank you. And I'm hoping you'll share the slides with us afterwards so we can sort of see that again and think about how those might be implemented. And I also just wanted to call out, like, sometimes when I introduce things in such a direct way, like collaboration, right? Like, we are asking you to collaborate and this is how you do it. It feels like I struggle because I'm like, am I being too obvious, right? Like, is this stuff that students already know? But the more I do it, the more I think, no, this is really required. They really need this. And picturing myself as a student, I love when I feel like I already know something and then a professor talks about it, because it's a way to sort of practice things and get the deeper knowledge and apply it in different ways. And so I try with everything that I do in my classes to think like, do students need any instruction for this? And so this is a piece of collaboration, is giving and receiving feedback. So I think that gets to incorporating diverse perspectives into your work. And so that's the point of like collaboration. You can evaluate that when it's an individual project, if you're requiring students to go out and get things externally. And so in one of my classes last week, I had 20 minutes of class on here are best practices for giving and receiving feedback. And with receiving feedback, I find that sometimes students, if like they're meeting with a peer mentor or a faculty mentor or someone, like they want to incorporate every single thing someone tells them to do, which can blow up their entire project, right? And so it's, how do you consider feedback from external stakeholders? How do you ask for feedback, and then requiring them to give feedback to each other during presentations?
Yeah.
So anyway, just another example of a piece that's really important recently. That's all.
I agree. Ben, what do you want to say?
I mean, a lot of this is stuff that we given that who was involved in the initial creation of the rubric, a lot of this is stuff that we do in the game studio, and we've through trial and error as much as intentional development sort of found a model that we scaffold this up over time. So one of the things that makes our programs unique and highly successful is that we do 4 years of collaboration. And in the first years, they are small teams that are short-lived with simplistic projects. So, hey, 3-4 students, here's this very sort of constrained project that you're going to work on for 3 weeks. And then when they're seniors, it's 15 to 30 weeks with a much bigger project, and they have to add more students and go through talking about stages of team formation and experience Brooks' laws of numbers and communications, all these things like firsthand. And we also have reflection scaffolded. So there's a bunch of prompts throughout the first and second year that are targeted not only to get to know the students better, like tell me about the worst team or best team you ever had, right? And get to know them better, but also to get them to reflect about their current and past teams within the semester, right? And so there's lots of reflection. In later years, the prompts get less frequent, but the reflections get deeper, right? So we're asking them to reflect on, they get to pick the topic, but we actually want them to kind of like dive in, like, all right, so here's what happened, and here's why it happened, and here's what I could have done to prevent it, here's what I tried to do to prevent it, here's what I learned from it, here's the outcome. Like, so like it's really much more comprehensive thinking about those things, and it's a good interview prep, right? Because like, tell me about the can pull that stuff right out of the top of their mind. And when Becky gets the horn, she can talk a little bit. So we've been trying to find a rubric that gives us the breadth of feedback that students need, along with the detail that is also practical for a faculty to do for 20, 40, 60 students, like in relatively short order, because we have lots of students. Good problem to have. And how much of this is stuff that we observe, right? We see it in the way that students present their projects in class, and the way we observe them communicating on our chat tool, and the things that we see them doing in our project management tool. But we're also relying on peer evaluations, because the seniors, I see them in class 3 hours a week. They're doing 12 plus hours of work every week. Peer evaluations providing additional perspective. And to an earlier point, we from Hadley, like, we coach students on how to give and receive feedback, because in the early years we allow them to anonymize that. The students fill out surveys, and we sort of summarize that feedback back to the student. But in later years, the students give feedback directly. Like they fill out a form, but like, we're just like, here are the results. And I was just going through with one of the senior team, give direct feedback last semester, and they were just freaking out. They're like, we don't want to do this. It's going to cause bad blood and all these different things. And I was like, first of all, giving some anonymous constructive feedback is going to make them way more paranoid than telling them to their face, right? Like, who said this? Why do they hate me, right? And it opens dialogue channels to have follow-up discussions about it, and we talked about bringing things like high quality emotional connections that have tensility and high carrying capacity. And I was like, think about your best friend. They are not the person who only tells you what you want to hear, right? They're the person that holds you accountable and helps you be better, right? So we've got a lot of examples of this in the game studio, and it's far from perfect, and we're always iterating. But if the college writ large, or even just specific programs, wanted to borrow from that, and because we've been through trial by fire with a lot of this stuff, so a lot of the things are sort of battle tested. Getting weird lens flare there for a second. And it's not all apples to apples, right? If you're going to be doing, I don't know, app development, or you're working on a group psychology product, like, it's not quite the same, but there's a lot of commonalities. And we've had some discussions, like collaboration and communication kind of go hand in hand. And the production courses, their learning outcomes are communication and collaboration. It has very little to do with the thing they are making, right? We aren't grading how good the game is, which is good because they're often really not great. But we're really concerned about their process and their collaboration. Like, did you try to do these things? Were you talking through the problems? Because that's the stuff that is ultimately going to make them more successful, right? I always get suspicious when the students are like, everything went great, and I'm like, that cannot possibly be true, right? That has never been true in the game studio, and will never be true, right? But I think that, and this is where, like, you and I would be at odds, maybe me and Kylie too, like, how much of this can actually be taught versus it has to be learned, right? And I think that you're right in that you need to kind of set students up for success, right? So we teach them about like agile project management, right, as a way to decide as a group what you're doing, and to set goals that you can hold each other accountable to, and so forth. But it doesn't stick until they've been through a bunch of cycles with it. A good example is, like, if you have first year students read 5 dysfunctions of a team, they're like, I don't get it. And then you have them read it as sophomores, juniors, seniors, and they immediately recognize the archetypical characters as, like, oh, I've been on a team with Mikey. I've been on a team with JR, right? Because they see that stuff.
So I would absolutely agree that the process orientation and the learning by doing is a really fundamental piece of that. Certainly, that's true of a lot of the competencies that we sort of came to recognize the extent to which the processes was really important for things like creative thinking, which we're not calling creativity. But I would suggest also that in order to get access to that, the only way you truly get access to that is through sort of reflection and peer evaluation. And I'd love to hear, maybe give Jonathan and Rebecca a chance next, but I'd love to hear some more discussion about peer evaluation versus sort of individual evaluation. Jonathan, you've been waiting. What would you like to say?
Yeah, so my comment is actually pretty simple, I think. So on one of your slides, Craig, you said, you would think about, like, having the students focus on a particular criterion of the competency each cycle. And I think that's kind of interesting approach, because in my experience, I have to do that totally holistically. So each week, touching base on basically everything, right? And, like, okay, well, the idea you've proposed has serious problems with, DEIB, or, discussion about the failure of the team to communicate effectively, or make a meeting, or have an agenda for the meeting, or, all those sorts of functional elements and tools of collaboration. So I thought that was a really interesting approach, and I was hoping that you were just doing it in terms of focus, but that was my main comment.
Well, I think that I would break them up a little bit, because I see them, certain things falling sort of at certain points in the process. So it's not that communication is important throughout. It's just that, what is the first thing they should be doing? Well, they should be agreeing on what they're actually doing. And then they should be starting with initial role identification. So it seemed to me sort of naturally to break down where I'm going to, and those first 3 steps come pretty close to one another. it's not like, oh, there's a huge gap in between check-in 1 and check-in 2, but there's a my schema, the way I was thinking about it is like those first 3 check-ins would happen within 3 weeks of each other. And so let's say there's like a 9-week project or something like that, that those would happen very quickly right off the bat, because they're all important early on in the process, but I also feel that there's sort of a natural order to them in the way that I envision it. It's like, okay, let's start by figuring out the group. And you can combine them too, I think, as you know, but if they're always thinking about all the things all the time, well, they like them to be that way, but I think it helps them to sort of focus on certain things, and not have to answer every single one of those criteria every week. I think that would drive them a little bit crazy, and I don't think it's truly necessary unless, you know, they or you start to see issues starting to crop up, in which case you can then sort of go like, well, you know, deadlines didn't get hit this week, you know, what's your accountability processes? Let's circle back and see what's happening there. So Rebecca or Becky, what do you prefer? I heard you refer to
Usually Becky.
Okay,
but
thanks.
I'm good with whatever. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this, so I'll try not to take up time. But yeah, a lot of these 6 items are baked into the studio process, but I think some problems that we've sort of solved for is like the group project problem. I think we're trying something now where we're doing an individual grade, but a large component of that, 30% of that, is your collaboration skills. Like personally, are you doing everything that you could do to collaborate with others? And I'm interested to see how that shakes out. I'm hopeful for that, but I think taking the pressure off the group grade versus individual grade, I'm hoping that works out well for us. But the problems that we're running into is, I think the cohesive vision, I think they're really struggling with the how of cohesive vision. And I really like Brene Brown's language around rumbling with vulnerability and having these vulnerable conversations about finding building like a cohesive vision. So I think that we're still struggling with that, but I feel like that could go on for days. That well one's incredibly deep. And then the other thing that I'm running into that I don't have a solve for is like the peer reviews and accounting for neurodiversity. So I think that the expectations that some students have of each other are misaligned with some students' abilities in terms of their communication styles. And you know, if you have a student who's ASD and they're constantly getting feedback that is completely misaligned with the skills and abilities that they bring to their team, it's really frustrating for them, and it's frustrating for me. So I don't have a solve for that. That's just something I'm dealing with. And then the other thing is the emotional labor of being the instructor for one of these collaboration courses. So I'm teaching 4 collaboration courses right now, and so it's incredibly intense to provide that multiple check-ins. So how do we enable ourselves to provide that accountability and not overextend ourselves to where we're short with students, or we're not able to be as detailed as we want to be, because we don't have the capacity to account for that. So I think looking for structures, and I think this structure is helpful, and we're trying to build more of that into our grading rubrics for projects. But it's exhausting to hold students accountable for this stuff.
A couple things I'd just like to highlight there is things I'd love to talk more about. One is that the breakdown the grade between the group project and the individual, I've increasingly moved towards individual grades for process as a way of sort of helping provide some assurance for students who are in a group where the group is failing, but through no particular fault of their own. They're pulling their weight, they're even going beyond. So I'd love to hear how other people sort of handle that. I'd be very curious to know. And the point about neurodiversity and peer reviews, that's the other thing I'd love to hear more about from other people, is how you handle those issues of neurodiversity and how you would handle peer reviews. And I might ask might send an email follow-up with the slides, but also I'd be very curious to know what kind of prompts, assignment prompts, that, especially for those of you in the game program, that you, Kyle, as well, are using when you're asking about these questions. Amanda?
You actually just jumped right in where I wanted to just emphasize and why maybe some of your core faculty counterparts are leery of going into, providing group work. If your intent in your class is to grade the thing that they're making, you're making a mistake with group work, because that puts them into the situation where one person does all the work. We've really shifted away in the production classes, the studio classes, to grading the thing. What we do is we grade the process, we grade their interactions, how they've individually performed, we grade on their ability to respond to feedback, to iterate, all the things that are about collaboration. But we don't, and they get lots of critique on the thing. And they also get graded on whether or not they've acted on that critique to improve it. But we don't say that game is an A and that game's a B. It really is about the journey that they're on and how they responded to all the things that happened to them along the way to get better at what they're doing, they're communicating, they're collaborating, and the making of the thing. So that that helps. It's not perfect, but it takes a little bit of pressure off of one person having to do all of it.
So what I would ask is the grading on the process a group grade or individual grade, or is there a breakdown there?
It's both.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's one of the struggles that these guys are facing, is because the sort of interrogation process you have to go through to figure out who's doing what, where, when, and how well are they doing it, and who's covering for whom, and it's like it's a lot of work. And then you have to give people feedback.
Yeah. Just to respond to something that Rebecca said earlier about how you lighten the load, I would say ask Jonathan and Kylie, maybe if you have as well, for the original rubric that you guys brought forward that had much more granular criteria, and see if that's something you might be able to use, because it's a lot easier to sort of, write extensively. I have some colleagues who they're like, yeah, we like the criteria, but we don't like the levels. So give us just the criteria in an open box for us to write comments in. And that's how they want to do it. So we created a version for them. But then there's others who like, actually, I'd rather just tick the boxes and give feedback more immediately that way, and then a little bit of summary written at the end. And that might be something. And so probably worth asking Jonathan if he still has that rubric kicking around to see if he's willing to share it with you. So, because I think it could be really useful. Yeah, Ben, you were next in line.
Yeah, and just following what Amanda said, so like one of my senior teams is 16 students, and so they're providing updates every week. So I'm seeing their process every week. They go through a sprint planning cycle. So they do backlog refinement. They prioritize their tasks. They do sprint planning. They do stand-ups throughout the week. At the end of the week, they do a review and they show off all their work. They do a retrospective to talk about what's working, what's not working, what are we going to change, right? There's lots of sort of like micro reflections built into the Scrum process. But with 16 students, like you have to draw like a ton of different data points to try to figure out like, this is not progressing how it should be. And so what are the forces at play, right? So we might look at, so I'll give them feedback on, wow, your sprint planning is rough. Like you're planning tasks that don't have clear description. Done looks like for the week. You might look and say, you're under committing. Like the capstone students are supposed to, log roughly 12 hours a week. And so it's like, well, you're coming in only planning 6 hours of work. So of course you're not making as much progress as you want. Or maybe, wow, you did 20 hours last week. What happened? And it's like, well, I overcommitted. And then rather than like saying so, I just like plowed through it, right? And really talk about like, well, let's make sure that you don't repeat that mistake. But then it gets even trickier when like the team is like getting stuck on an idea and they're like butting heads, right? And so this is where I might bring in something. I actually bring up 5 dysfunctions a lot with the seniors these days, because it's like one of my teams is like, right, you're thinking very much about like, I'm doing the task, my task is getting done, but you're not focused on the end result of like, is the game moving forward? So it's like my work, my individual success over that of the team. And
that's all
I
about
just
cohesive vision,
team,
I would say.
yeah, I just had another team that put one of their team members on a PIP, right? Because you can put your team members on an improvement plan, which adds a layer of craziness to the senior experience, right? But like they have to have, you know, here are the problematic behaviors. Here is like how the effect it's having. Here's what we want to be seeing. Here's what we're going to do differently to help you get there, right? Like it's really yeah, you can fire them, which
Yeah,
I want to have a separate conversation about that.
Yeah,
but it's just to finish that thought, it's so like, and what I was telling the leads in that team though is like, you have this team member that like definitely has some collaborative issues. Like you give them some feedback and their response is go do it yourself. Okay, not great. But you know, I dug a little bit deeper. I was like, you're also not doing a lot to help this person be successful. And in most collaborative friction, it's not one-sided. Both parties are having some effect on it. And so again, like it goes back, like these classes, their teaching load, the emotional labor, like Becky said, is pretty high. And on one hand, like, oh yeah, maybe we could make some changes, but I also feel like part of what makes things so successful is that there is so much mentorship and there is so much guiding and coaching and everything else. And you can't really like, you can streamline it to a point before you're not actually doing it well anymore.
Yeah. Just to give you a snap, you had earlier talked, Ben, very eloquently about the scaffolding, the really intense scaffolding that takes place in the game program, in the game studio, and it's like that's my model. I think that probably from a teaching collaboration standpoint, you do a better job than any other program on campus. But just to let you know how it's embodied in new core. So second semester, first year, there's a core 104 is where they're introduced to collaboration, the principles of collaboration, and they're not required to do group projects, but they do engage in some form of collaboration, and there's some teaching collaboration. And then in core 202, that's where it's amped up a little bit. So it's scaffolded over 2 successive core courses. We originally had, in the original design of the core, there was a 3rd year sort of mini core capstone 5-credit course, and unfortunately that was shot down by the other divisions because it wouldn't fit with travel abroad and what have you. So it's sad that we sort of lost that last opportunity, but in terms of where your students could be, they are getting some exposure in second semester, first year, and first semester, second year to collaboration principles. So there hopefully is some transfer of learning there. John?
There. Yeah, I wanted to speak to the rubric question. I do have the rubric. I have it in Canvas format. I have it such that you can just include it in your courses. It's probably still in Canvas and available to you. We had numerous versions of that rubric. The one that I'm talking about is the 37-row rubric, or whatever number it was, that freaked Craig out. Kylie and I were the big fans of that rubric because it was something that we could drop into our courses. And Kylie and I both pilot tested that rubric in our courses. So I think that there's some opportunity for improvement for us there in that space to take the 2 rubrics and kind of figure out what the right size is for the EGD faculty. I certainly, in my EGD courses that I was using it in, found it to be a very tedious process with so many rows. So it needs to be made shorter. And the one we have for the rubric overall, I think would be very appropriate when assessing students. But it has to be understood that it's a developmental rubric by the students and not something you just slap points onto. Does that make sense?
That's really important because we don't necessarily, I mean, and the message to communicate, I'm so glad you brought that up, Jonathan, is that, you know, we don't expect you to be proficient coming in. We expect you to be proficient by the time you graduate. So if you're a first-year student and you're only scoring one, you know, at the emerging or developing level, that's totally fine. We expect that. This is part of the value add of a college degree, is that we're going to help you develop this to a really high level. Yeah, Amanda?
So I want to just toss that out here, toss something out here as you're thinking about, okay, where do we do this in other parts of the college, or do we encourage other people to do it? The dark underbelly of all this is that all the problems you have in interacting with other people in a collaborative fashion, in private spaces, or in a workplace, happen at college as well. So we're talking about sexual harassment, racism, bias, all these things. And, if you're in a classroom and you're all doing your individual work, and your only interaction with the people in the classroom is when you're having a group discussion, that whole environment is really controlled. But when you tell students to go off and work collaboratively somewhere else in other spaces, stuff happens. And on a small campus like that, like this, it can go badly. And unfortunately, we haven't been super successful yet in figuring out how to intervene quickly, because often we hear about these things well after the fact, sometimes years. And when we're putting teams together, there's also dynamics that we're not always aware of. So when we do our final team work, where the students are coming together and we have to place students on a team for those final projects, we ask them, they fill out a survey, and there's a lot of information in there. And sometimes we have to take that, to bias incidents and Title IX reports and stuff, because it can get ugly. So I just want people to go in with their eyes open. There are issues of bias and equity and all sorts of things that can happen in these collaborative environments, that even you could set all the boundaries and say, do not do or say the following things, and somebody will. So how do you deal with that? How do you find out early? And that's what we're still trying to perfect, because it is a risk that we put our students in.
That's a really good point. I am a little bit mindful of the time. It's 4:01. I'm happy to stick around. Rebecca, maybe you can probably stop recording now. But I'm happy to stick around, because I still think the neurodiversity question that Becky brought up is really worth thinking about. And